All right, hello. I thought I would give y'all a different background today than just the wall in one of the rooms of my house. So here we are in my backyard, and we're here to talk about seeing the pattern of argument in an excerpt. So what we're going to try to practice is seeing an excerpt that is something that hasn't been in many cases, the argument isn't clearly stated, or there may be some pieces missing or some extra noise in there, stuff that's not relevant to the argument. And what we're going to do is we're going to start from really simple cases and work up to slightly more complex cases and practice taking that argument as it is in the excerpt and putting it into a valid pattern. You have a document that you've been given from multiple sessions called valid patterns. And what those are is those are good patterns of reasoning. And we'll talk about what that means in just a minute here. In a minute, I'm going to share my screen. And what I'm going to have is multiple excerpts. Most everything, except for one, I made up, fabricated out of nowhere. Excerpts that are meant to be from simple to slightly more complex. And I've given you multiple argument patterns. What I want you to do in every single case, make yourself do this. Stop the recording before I give you the answer and see if you can figure out which of those valid patterns the argument in the excerpt fits into. Does that make sense? Well, so what you're going to do is I'll give you an excerpt. The first ones are shorter, the last ones are longer. Look at it when I give you a prompt to, pause the video and see if you can figure out which of the patterns that I give you below that excerpt which is the pattern that it fits into. Okay, so let me share my screen now. Okay, here we are. So here in bold, in the darker font, is the excerpt. This is really short, right? I said we're walking in from the shallow end of the pool here. So, and then below I've given you 5 different patterns. Now, this is not all the patterns that you were given in the valid patterns document as a reading, but these are 5 of them. And I just didn't want to be switching back and forth between that document and this. I didn't want y'all to have to be switching back and forth. But you can go look at that document if you want. But here's 5 patterns. Now, I want you to take this excerpt and see if you can see which of these patterns it fits into. And if you can do that, then it's an easy, direct way of getting a valid reconstruction of the argument. That is a reconstruction on which, if the premises are true, the conclusion has to be true. Because each of these patterns is a valid pattern. If you put sentences in for the variables A, B, and C, then you'll have a valid argument. So what these are is their patterns or their forms. And what that means is each variable A or B or C, in many cases just A and B, stands for a sentence. So if you put a sentence in for A and you put a sentence in for B, if you put a sentence in for C, as long as you keep that the same sentence across the instances, so look at this second argument form, if A then B, A therefore B. If you put the same sentence in for A, whether it's in the first or the second premise, and the same sentence in for B, whether it's in the first premise or the conclusion, 3, then you'll get a valid argument. So that's why I'm recommending this process. If you can fit the argument from an excerpt into one of these patterns, you will automatically get a valid argument, as long as you keep the sentences constant across those instances of A or across those instances of the variables. Okay, so hopefully that's clear. So now I'm going to prompt y'all, take a minute, look at this very short excerpt about rain and cloudiness that I just made up, and see if you can see which of these patterns it fits into. Do that now. Okay, so I'll give you the answer now. The answer is this second one. Now, what tells me that? Well, in this case, there's a very clear conditional. If it's raining, then it's cloudy. So that's a pretty good indicator that the argument form is going to have a conditional in it. Now, it turns out that all but one of these have a conditional in the argument. This last one does not have a conditional. That is an if-then claim in the argument form. So that doesn't narrow it down that much for us. But what it does do is it tells us, okay, if the conditional is if A then B, then A is going to be it's raining, and B is going to be it's cloudy. And in this particular excerpt, what we get in the second sentence is it's raining. So the second premise, I'm assuming y'all realize that the conclusion is it's cloudy because that comes after the so. But what that means is the second premise should be A, right? Because the conditional is if A, then B. A is it's raining, and here we get it's raining as a second premise. So it should be if A, then B, A. And then the conclusion is it's cloudy, which we just said in that conditional is B. So that's the argument form we get, and it turns out that's this one right here. That's what kind of told me that that excerpt should fit into that valid pattern. So if we wanted to put it in here, we would just do it exactly as it sits, pretty much. If it's raining, then it's cloudy. It's raining, therefore it's cloudy. So we just put it into this form. That's what I mean by putting it into a valid form or a valid pattern. Now, here we have a valid argument put into the premise conclusion, the numbered form that we're looking for. That's as easy as it is for these really simple cases. Now, you might think, what if we added by doing this? What has this whole process served? Because really all we changed is the so into a therefore, and we put some numbers in front of stuff. So the answer to that question is, in this case, we didn't change that much. In this case, putting it into this numbered format didn't do much, but that's only because this is a very simple, clear, artificial case. In many cases, the argument structure will not be so clear. You'll have lots of things that are there that are irrelevant to the argument. They're not premises or conclusion, it's just noise in the argument. You'll have things that are unsaid but need to be said, so they're implicit premises, or maybe the conclusion isn't even stated. The conclusion is implicit or unstated. And so putting it into this form will actually add a lot to the clarity of the argument. And why do you want a clear argument? Well, it's good just to be clear on the argument, on what the argument structure is, to see how the argument works. But it's also good for the end of being able to evaluate the argument, right? So if I have this argument, say, in this case, like I said, we haven't added much by putting it into this format of the premise conclusion format or the numbered format. But now I can actually talk more clearly, even in this case, about which premise I might have a problem with, right? So this is a little toy, stupid argument. So I'm not really going to be giving objections to the claim that it's raining, right? I mean, right now I might point to my background and say it's clearly not raining. So premise 2 is false. And putting it in this format makes that a little easier to say. I can say, look, I can actually point to premise 2 and say, that's the one I think is false. I agree that if it's raining, then it's cloudy, right? But the point is it's not raining. Okay, that will become way more important with more substantive, more complex arguments that you will see this in future examples. So I won't belabor the point here, but when it becomes more complex, you often think you have a problem with the argument, or you want to support the argument, but you don't know how, or you don't know what the problem is exactly. And putting it into this valid pattern, putting maybe unstated premises, stating them explicitly, will actually help you evaluate the argument. It might be that that unstated premise is exactly the one that there's the problem with, right? It wasn't stated in the excerpt, so you couldn't look at the excerpt and see, but once you figure out what pattern it's fitting into, what has to be stated in order for this to be a good argument, you see this premise that shows up in the valid form of it, or the valid pattern that was just implicit or unstated in the excerpt. And now you can say, oh, that's the thing I've actually got a problem with, right? So that's what this is really going to help with, the more complex arguments. So let me just highlight this for you. Can I highlight? Yes. That was the argument form that this excerpt fit in.